She had no home, no protection from the cold, and no reason to stop. On a freezing winter night, a teenage girl everyone had learned to ignore made a single choice that put her own life at risk. In a world where her skin color and her poverty already marked her as invisible, helping the wrong person could cost her everything. Yet she stayed. She endured the cold. And before sunrise, her quiet act of humanity exposed a truth about race, fear, and compassion that still makes people uncomfortable today. What really happened that night, and why did it change so many lives forever? Before we go on, if you're new here, subscribe to Stories of Racism and connect with us for powerful stories every day. And tell us, where are you watching from today? Jasmine Brooks had learned to live light, not because she wanted to, but because life had taught her that anything you carried too tightly could be taken away. At 17, she owned what fit into a worn backpack and whatever she could keep safe inside her jacket pockets. She moved through the city quietly, the way people like her learned to do, unnoticed when possible, cautious when not. Chicago didn't slow down for anyone, and it certainly didn't pause for a black teenage girl with no fixed address and no safety net. Her days followed a fragile rhythm. Mornings were about finding warmth, libraries, subway stations, anywhere she could sit without being questioned too closely. Afternoons were spent doing what she could to stay invisible while still staying alive. Nights were the hardest. Night meant cold, and cold meant danger, especially in winter, especially in December when the wind off the lake felt sharp enough to cut skin and hope alike. Jasmine hadn't always lived this way. Once she had a home that smelled like laundry soap and Sunday dinners. Once she had a grandmother who believed that kindness was a form of survival. Grandma Rose had raised her with firm hands and a soft heart, teaching her that dignity mattered even when the world tried to strip it away. When Grandma Rose died suddenly from a stroke, everything else unraveled fast. The house disappeared. The stability disappeared. And eventually, the system that was supposed to protect kids like Jasmine quietly let her go. By 17, she had aged out of places that pretended to be temporary but felt permanent until they weren't. No warnings, no long goodbyes, just a reminder that youth, like compassion, often came with an expiration date. On paper, Jasmine was free. In reality, she was alone. That December evening, the city glowed in ways that felt cruel. Warm light spilled from tall windows in wealthy neighborhoods, illuminating decorated trees, full tables, families gathered together. Jasmine walked past it all, her thin jacket pulled tight around her body, her breath fogging the air. She kept moving because stopping meant letting the cold settle in, and she couldn't afford that. She had $23 in her pocket and no place to spend the night. She was painfully aware of how she looked to the outside world. A young black girl walking slowly through expensive streets with a backpack wasn't seen as lost or vulnerable. She was seen as suspicious. Jasmine had learned that lesson early. It shaped where she walked, how long she stayed in one place, and how quickly she crossed the street if a car slowed down beside her. Survival meant awareness. Survival meant caution. Still, there were moments when instinct pulled her in the opposite direction. Moments when the lessons her grandmother taught her pushed against the fear the world had given her. That tension lived inside Jasmine constantly, the pull between staying safe and staying human. Most nights, fear won. That night felt no different, at first. The cold deepened as the hours passed. Snow threatened the sky, heavy and waiting. Jasmine's fingers burned, then numbed. Her thoughts stayed focused on one thing: make it to morning. She told herself she didn't need much, just enough strength to keep walking, just enough warmth to keep her body from shutting down. She didn't know yet that the night had already begun to change course. She didn't know that a single sound, a single moment, would force her to confront everything she'd learned about risk, race, and who was allowed to help whom. She didn't know that by sunrise her life, and someone else's, would be forever altered. All Jasmine knew was that she was cold, alone, and moving forward. And sometimes that's exactly where the story begins, right before everything goes wrong. or right before everything finally becomes clear. The city had its own rules at night, and Jasmine understood them well. Don't linger. Don't attract attention. Don't trust that help will come just because you need it. She had learned those lessons not from books or warnings, but from experience. Looks that lingered too long, voices that changed when she asked for directions, the subtle tightening in people's faces when they realized she had nowhere to go. Racism wasn't always loud. Most of the time it was quiet, built into assumptions, into who was believed and who was questioned. As she walked, Jasmine replayed her options over and over, even though she knew there weren't many. The shelters were full. The all-night diner she sometimes sat in had already asked her not to come back unless she bought something. The train stations were being monitored more closely now that winter had settled in. Everywhere felt temporary, unwelcoming, cold in more ways than one. She adjusted the straps of her backpack, feeling the familiar shapes inside, her journal, a folded photograph, and the thin blanket at the bottom. The blanket was more than fabric. It was memory. It still smelled faintly like her grandmother's apartment, like warmth and safety, and a time when Jasmine didn't have to calculate every step. She rarely took it out. Some things felt too important to risk losing. The wind picked up, slicing through her clothes. Jasmine lowered her head and kept walking, her boots crunching softly against the frozen sidewalk. She counted her steps, a habit she'd picked up to keep her mind sharp when exhaustion threatened to pull her under. 100 steps, 200, don't stop. Don't think too far ahead, just move. In moments like these, she thought about how different her life might have been if she'd been born into a different zip code, a different skin, a different set of assumptions. She had done everything she was supposed to do, stayed out of trouble, tried to finish school, kept her head down. But none of that protected her from becoming invisible. None of it stopped the world from deciding she was on her own. Still, there was a part of Jasmine that refused to harden completely. It was the part her grandmother had nurtured, the part that believed kindness mattered even when it wasn't returned. Jasmine didn't talk about that part much. It felt dangerous. Vulnerability always did. Caring too much could get you hurt, or worse. As the night grew quieter, the streets emptier, Jasmine became more aware of every sound. The distant hum of traffic, the rattle of bare branches, the soft echo of her own footsteps. Her body ached and fatigue settled deep in her bones. She knew the signs. She knew how quickly cold could turn from discomfort into something far more serious. She told herself she just needed to find a place shielded from the wind, somewhere to sit for a few minutes, somewhere safe enough to rest without drawing attention, just until the worst of the night passed. That was the plan. Simple, careful, controlled. What she didn't know was that plans mean very little when reality interrupts them. That sometimes, survival isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about the moments when doing the right thing feels like the most dangerous choice of all. And somewhere ahead, waiting in the shadows of a city that had already taken so much from her, was a test Jasmine never saw coming. The sound reached her before she understood it, soft at first, almost lost beneath the wind, then sharper, urgent, unmistakably human. A cry, not loud enough to draw attention but desperate enough to cut through the night. Jasmine slowed her steps. Every instinct she had told her to keep moving. Sounds like that led to questions. Questions led to trouble. And trouble had a way of finding people who looked like her far more easily than it found anyone else. She hesitated, heart pounding, eyes scanning the empty street. Nothing moved. No cars, no pedestrians, just tall gates, darkened mansions, and the steady glow of security lights. The cry came again, trembling, confused, frightened. Jasmine swallowed hard. She thought about police sirens, about handcuffs, about how quickly good intentions could be twisted into suspicion. A homeless black girl standing beside someone else's property after midnight didn't look like a hero. It looked like a problem. She told herself she'd just check, just look, just make sure no one was in immediate danger, that was all. Between two towering homes, partially hidden from the street, she saw her. An elderly woman, barely dressed for the cold, crouched near a stone wall. Her white hair was loose and tangled, her thin nightgown clinging uselessly to her shaking body. Slippers, no socks, no coat. She clutched a framed photograph to her chest as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. The sight hit Jasmine like a wave of ice. This wasn't someone pretending, this wasn't a trick. This woman was freezing, confused, lost. Jasmine stepped closer, careful, her voice low and gentle. The woman looked up, eyes wide but unfocused, fear and confusion mixing together. Her words came out fragmented, disoriented. She was looking for someone. She was late. She didn't know where she was. Jasmine recognized the signs immediately. Dementia. She'd seen it before. She lived it. Her grandmother's final months had been filled with moments just like this, lucidity slipping through fingers, time folding in on itself. Jasmine's chest tightened. This wasn't just dangerous. It was personal. She glanced back toward the street, still empty, still quiet. The temperature was dropping fast. Leaving wasn't an option anymore. Not really. If Jasmine walked away now, she knew exactly how this would end. But staying came with its own risks. She considered calling for help. Then she imagined explaining herself, explaining why she was there, explaining why she didn't have an address, explaining why she didn't call sooner. She imagined the assumptions forming before she even finished her first sentence. She had learned that being honest didn't always protect you. Sometimes it did the opposite. So she made a choice. She wrapped her jacket around the woman's shoulders, even as the cold bit immediately into her own skin. The woman protested weakly, but Jasmine reassured her, voice steady even as her hands trembled. They tried walking together, slowly, carefully, checking gates and doors, hoping something would spark recognition. Nothing did. The street stayed silent. The houses stayed closed. Minutes passed, then more. The woman's steps faltered, her strength faded. Eventually, her legs gave out completely. They settled into a shallow alcove near a large gate, partially shielded from the wind. Jasmine felt the cold seep deeper now, through muscle and bone, dulling sensation, slowing thought. She knew what that meant. She also knew she couldn't stop. She pulled out the blanket from her backpack. The last thing she had that truly mattered, her grandmother's blanket, worn thin, full of holes, still carrying the faintest trace of warmth from another life. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. For a moment, she hesitated. Giving it up felt like losing her grandmother all over again. Then she looked at the woman beside her, at the way her body shivered uncontrollably, at the way fear and confusion crossed her face. Jasmine wrapped the blanket around both of them. Hours stretched endlessly. The cold intensified. Snow began to fall, quiet and relentless. Jasmine talked constantly, forcing words out through numb lips, telling stories, asking questions, doing anything to keep the woman awake. She could feel her own body starting to fail, shivering, slowing, thoughts blurring, exhaustion pressing down like a weight. At one point, the woman looked at her with startling clarity. She noticed how pale Jasmine was, how her hands trembled. Concern flickered across her face. And in that moment, the imbalance of the situation became painfully clear. The one with nothing was giving everything. The one society had taught to be cautious, invisible, expendable, was the only reason this woman was still alive. As the night deepened, the danger shifted from hypothetical to immediate. Jasmine could feel it. The cold was no longer just cold. It was heavy, seductive. It whispered that rest would feel good, that closing her eyes would be easier. She fought it with everything she had left. She stayed awake because she had promised herself she would, because leaving wasn't an option she could live with, because, in a world that had already failed her so many times, she refused to become someone who walked away. And somewhere unseen, the consequences of that choice were already moving toward her, headlights cutting through the darkness, questions forming, judgments waiting to be made. Jasmine didn't know it yet, but the most dangerous part of the night wasn't the cold. It was what would happen when help finally arrived. The snow thickened as the night wore on, softening the sharp edges of the world while making everything else more dangerous. It muffled sound, erased footprints, and hid how long they had been sitting there. Time lost its shape. Jasmine no longer trusted minutes or hours, only the steady rise and fall of the woman's chest against her own, the proof that she was still alive. Jasmine's body was failing her in quiet, terrifying ways. The shivering slowed, then stopped. Her fingers felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. She knew enough to understand what that meant. Hypothermia didn't always announce itself with pain. Sometimes it came with calm, with a strange, heavy peace that tempted you to let go. Jasmine fought it by talking, by focusing on the sound of her own voice, by clinging to the responsibility she'd taken on. The woman drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes gripping Jasmine's sleeve, sometimes murmuring names from another time. Each time her head sagged too low, Jasmine adjusted the blanket, pulled her closer, used her own body as a shield against the wind. Every adjustment stole more heat from Jasmine and gave it to the stranger she refused to abandon. Fear crept in, not just fear of dying, but fear of what would happen if they survived. Fear of explanations, fear of being misunderstood, fear of a system that had never given her the benefit of the doubt. Jasmine imagined flashing lights in the distance and felt her stomach tighten. Help could save them, or it could bring consequences she wasn't ready to face. She thought about how this scene might look to someone arriving late. A homeless black teenager pressed against an elderly white woman on private property in a wealthy neighborhood. No context, no explanation, just assumptions waiting to be made. Jasmine had seen enough of the world to know how quickly stories were written about people like her. Still, she didn't move away, didn't loosen her grip, didn't regret the choice she'd made. The night pressed on, relentless. Snow gathered on their shoulders, on the blanket, on Jasmine's hair. Her eyelids grew heavy. She fought sleep with memories, her grandmother's laugh, the way she braided Jasmine's hair on Sunday mornings, the warmth of a kitchen that no longer existed. She whispered those memories aloud, not sure if she was speaking to the woman beside her or to herself. At some point, the woman became frightened again, sensing something was wrong. She asked not to be left alone. Jasmine answered immediately, her voice slurred but sincere, promising she wasn't going anywhere. She meant it, even as her thoughts scattered, even as the cold hollowed her out from the inside. The city remained indifferent. No doors opened. No footsteps passed. The security lights continued their quiet watch over manicured lawns and stone walls, illuminating everything except the human cost unfolding just beyond their reach. Jasmine wondered briefly if this was how people disappeared, not in dramatic moments but in silence, in places where help was just close enough to exist but too far away to matter. She wondered if anyone would remember her name if she didn't make it through the night. The thought hurt more than the cold. Then somewhere in the distance, sound cut through the snowfall. An engine, tires crunching over ice. Jasmine forced her eyes open, straining to focus. Lights swept across the street, then closer, brighter. Footsteps followed, fast, panicked, uneven. Voices broke the stillness, shocked, horrified, calling out into the dark. Relief and fear collided inside Jasmine at the same time. This was it. The moment everything shifted. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but her mouth wouldn't cooperate. Her tongue felt thick and useless. She gathered what little strength she had left and pushed out the truth as simply as she could, that the woman had been lost, that she couldn't leave her, that she did what she could. Hands reached for them, warm hands, urgent hands. The woman beside her was lifted first, wrapped in coats, surrounded by voices. Jasmine felt the sudden absence of weight, of warmth, and the cold rushed back in like a wave. Someone noticed her then. Someone shouted her name, even though she hadn't said it yet. The last thing Jasmine felt was movement, being lifted, being carried, the world tilting violently. The last thing she thought was not about fear or regret, but about whether the woman was safe. And then the darkness closed in. What happened next would expose more than one act of kindness. It would reveal who was protected, who was questioned, and how easily compassion could be overshadowed by prejudice. especially when it came from someone the world had already decided not to trust. Cold gave way to chaos. Sirens cut through the snow-heavy air, sharp and urgent, pulling the night apart. Jasmine drifted in and out as she was moved, the world flashing in fragments, red and blue light reflecting off ice, the rush of voices she couldn't fully process, the pressure of hands checking for signs of life. The warmth she'd longed for finally arrived, but it came with confusion and fear, her body struggling to understand the sudden change. Inside the ambulance, the contrast was overwhelming. Heat pressed against skin that no longer felt like it belonged to her. Her thoughts tangled. She tried to focus on breathing, on staying awake, on remembering why she was here. Somewhere nearby, the elderly woman was being treated too. That knowledge steadied Jasmine more than any blanket ever could. But even in those first moments of rescue, tension followed closely behind. Questions hovered in the air before they were ever asked. Who was she? Why was she there? How did she know the woman? Jasmine sensed the shift in attention, the way concern mixed with scrutiny. She had felt it before, care that came with conditions, help that required explanation. Her fear returned, sharper now than the cold had been. At the hospital, fluorescent lights replaced snowfall. Nurses moved quickly, efficiently, their focus on stabilizing bodies that had nearly been lost to the night. Jasmine was placed on a bed, monitors attached, blankets layered over her shaking frame. The warmth hurt, deep and aching, but she welcomed it. She clung to consciousness just long enough to hear that the woman was alive. That was enough. As Jasmine's body fought its way back from the edge, another kind of tension built outside her room. The story of the night was spreading, pieced together by security footage, emergency calls, and the reactions of people who had arrived too late to see the quiet bravery that had kept two hearts beating through the dark. In a city divided by wealth and race, context mattered, and it was often missing. Some saw a miracle, others saw a mystery, and some, shaped by long-held assumptions, saw a problem that needed explaining. Jasmine woke briefly to unfamiliar faces and measured looks. She sensed the weight of attention, the unspoken question of whether her presence required justification. Even now, even after nearly dying, she felt the need to prove herself, to show that she belonged in this story as more than a footnote or a suspicion. Meanwhile, the woman's family arrived, drawn by panic and guilt and relief all at once. Their shock at what had happened collided with something deeper, the realization that the person who saved their loved one was someone society rarely trusted, rarely protected, rarely celebrated. That realization unsettled more than it comforted. Outside the hospital room, decisions were being made. Reports were being written. Narratives were forming. Jasmine, still weak and barely aware, lay at the center of it all, unaware of how close she was to being misunderstood, or how narrowly the truth might slip through the cracks. The night had tested her body. Now the aftermath was testing something else entirely, how the world responded when kindness came from someone it had already written off. And as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in silence, one question lingered unanswered. Would Jasmine's sacrifice be seen for what it was, or would prejudice rewrite the story before she ever had the strength to tell it herself? Jasmine drifted between sleep and awareness, her body heavy, her mind fogged by exhaustion and medication. Each time her eyes opened, she felt the same tightening in her chest, the instinctive need to assess danger, to read the room, to understand how she was being seen. Even here, wrapped in blankets, she didn't feel entirely safe. She felt exposed. Voices filtered in and out, low, careful, controlled. She couldn't make out every word, but she recognized the tone. It was the sound of people trying to make sense of something that didn't fit their expectations. A homeless black teenager was not supposed to be the hero of this story. That unspoken truth hung in the air, shaping the way questions were asked and answers were weighed. When she was awake enough to notice, she saw two uniformed figures near the doorway. They weren't aggressive. They weren't kind either. They watched, waited, took notes. Jasmine's heart rate spiked. She fought the urge to explain herself immediately, to justify every decision she had made. Experience had taught her that speaking too quickly could be as dangerous as staying silent. Her thoughts raced despite her weakened state. She replayed the night over and over, finding the woman, giving her the jacket, wrapping the blanket around them both. She searched for anything she might have done wrong, any moment that could be misunderstood. She hated that this was where her mind went, that even after doing everything right, she still felt like she had to defend her humanity. Down the hall, the woman's family was grappling with their own reckoning. Shock gave way to gratitude, then to disbelief. They watched footage. They listened to timelines. And slowly, uncomfortably, they realized the truth. While wealth and security systems had failed, compassion from the most unlikely place had succeeded. That realization was powerful, but it was also unsettling. Because if someone like Jasmine could step up when everything else fell apart, then the story people told themselves about who mattered, who was dangerous, who was disposable, began to crack. Jasmine overheard fragments of conversation when staff came and went. Words like freezing, hours, life-threatening. She heard her own condition described clinically, stripped of emotion, hypothermia, exposure, risk factors. No one said out loud that her race and homelessness had increased those risks long before the temperature ever dropped, but it was there, woven into every assumption that had shaped her life. As the hours passed, her body slowly stabilized, but the tension around her did not ease. Instead, it shifted. The questions became quieter, more careful, but they didn't disappear. Who would take responsibility for her now? Where would she go? What happened next was no longer just about recovery. It was about what the world did with someone who didn't fit neatly into its systems. Jasmine sensed that her fate was being discussed in rooms she wasn't invited into, that decisions were being made about her future without her voice fully present. She had lived like this for years, existing in the margins of other people's choices. The fear that she might be returned to that invisible space pressed down on her harder than any blanket ever had. Yet something was different this time. She could feel it, in the way certain looks lingered with discomfort rather than dismissal, in the way silence followed when someone asked why she had done it, why she had stayed. The simple answer didn't satisfy people, because accepting it meant admitting that moral courage had come from someone society had taught them not to see. As Jasmine closed her eyes again, exhaustion finally overtaking fear, she didn't know which version of the story would win. The one shaped by gratitude and truth, or the one bent by bias and convenience. All she knew was that she had made her choice in the dark, without witnesses, without guarantees. And now, in the harsh light of morning, the world had to decide what to do with that choice. And with her, morning did not arrive gently. It came with fluorescent lights, clipped voices, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Jasmine woke to the sound of a monitor beeping steadily beside her bed. The warmth that had once felt like relief now pressed against her skin uncomfortably, almost painfully, as if her body didn't trust it yet. Every muscle ached. Her throat burned. Her head throbbed with a dull, relentless pressure. For a moment, she didn't know where she was or who she was supposed to be afraid of. Then she saw the room. Hospital clean, white too bright. And standing near the doorway, half inside and half outside, were two uniformed figures. Her chest tightened instantly. It didn't matter that they weren't shouting. It didn't matter that their hands weren't on their weapons. Jasmine's body reacted before her mind could catch up. Years of survival had trained her for this moment. The fear rose fast and sharp, flooding her veins with adrenaline she didn't have the strength to handle. She forced herself not to move. Don't panic. Don't say too much. Don't give them a reason. The door opened wider. A woman stepped in, well-dressed, composed, eyes rimmed red as if she hadn't slept. Behind her, the officers remained still, observant, watching. Jasmine knew without being told. This was her. The daughter. The woman's gaze landed on Jasmine, and something complicated crossed her face. Relief, shock, gratitude, and something else Jasmine recognized immediately. Uncertainty. Because gratitude was easy in theory. But standing face to face with the person who saved your loved one, when that person looked like Jasmine, forced a reckoning few people were prepared for. The room felt smaller, hotter. Every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the lights, the soft squeak of shoes in the hallway, the faint static of a radio clipped to a belt outside. One of the officers spoke calmly, professionally. They needed to understand what happened. Just routine, just clarity. Routine. That word had never meant safety to Jasmine. She swallowed hard and nodded even as her heart raced. She told the story again, slowly, carefully, every word measured, finding the woman, the cold, the jacket, the blanket, the hours in the snow. She left nothing out, but she also didn't embellish. She had learned that emotion could be mistaken for guilt. As she spoke, she watched their faces. The daughter's eyes filled with tears. One officer softened. The other remained unreadable. When Jasmine finished, silence stretched through the room. Then came the question she had been dreading. Why didn't you call for help? The room shifted. Jasmine felt it immediately, the subtle tightening, the invisible line being drawn. This was the moment where the story could turn, where compassion could be overshadowed by judgment, where her survival instincts might finally be used against her. She hesitated. Telling the truth felt dangerous. But lying felt worse. Because the truth wasn't about bad intentions, it was about fear. Fear shaped by history. Fear shaped by skin color. Fear shaped by knowing that the same act of kindness could be interpreted very differently depending on who performed it. Her voice was quiet when she answered. She said she was scared. Not scared of helping, but scared of what might happen after, scared of being misunderstood, scared of being blamed, scared that helping could turn into handcuffs instead of gratitude. The air in the room changed. No one interrupted her. She explained what it was like to be homeless and young and black in a city that saw danger before it saw need. How calling for help didn't always feel safe. How doing the right thing didn't guarantee protection. How sometimes staying quiet felt like the only way to survive. The words landed heavily. Because now this wasn't just a story about survival in the cold. It was about survival in a system. The daughter covered her mouth, tears slipping freely now. She looked at Jasmine, not as a stranger, not as a question mark, but as a mirror reflecting a reality she had never been forced to face. And still the officers said nothing. That silence was louder than any accusation. Jasmine felt her stomach drop. This was it. This was the moment where the world decided who she was. A hero or a liability. A savior or a suspect. And as the door slowly closed behind them, leaving the outcome uncertain, Jasmine realized something terrifying. Surviving the night might not have been the hardest part after all. The waiting was worse than the questions. After they left, time slowed to a crawl that felt almost cruel. Jasmine lay there listening to the steady beep of the monitor, each sound stretching longer than the last. She stared at the ceiling, counting cracks, counting breaths, counting the seconds until someone decided what she was going to become in this story. A hero, a victim, or a problem that needed to be managed quietly. Outside her room, voices rose and fell. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the rhythm, authority speaking, emotion pushing back, facts being weighed against assumptions. Every now and then the door opened just enough for fragments to slip through. Liability, protocol, security footage. Words that didn't belong to someone who had nearly frozen to death doing the right thing. Her hands trembled beneath the blankets, not from cold this time, but from fear. Because Jasmine understood how quickly narratives hardened, how once a version of events took shape, it became almost impossible to change. She had seen it before, people reduced to headlines, moments stripped of context, truth flattened into something easier to digest. And the truth about her didn't fit neatly into anyone's expectations. She was young, she was homeless, she was black. And now she was inconvenient. The door opened again. This time, more people entered the room. Hospital administration, another officer, and the daughter Catherine standing stiffly between them, her composure cracking at the edges. The air thickened instantly. Jasmine sat up slightly, wincing as pain flared through her body but refusing to look small. She had learned that sitting quietly didn't protect you either. The conversation resumed, this time in front of her. They spoke about procedures, about reports, about how unusual the situation was, about the need to ensure there had been no wrongdoing. The language was careful, sanitized, but the meaning underneath was sharp. They were searching for something, anything, that would complicate the story. Jasmine felt the familiar frustration rise in her chest, the anger she usually swallowed down because it had never been safe to express it. She wanted to scream that none of this would be happening if she looked different, if she lived in one of the houses they had passed that night, if her kindness came wrapped in wealth instead of sacrifice. Catherine interrupted them. Her voice shook, but it was firm. She said they were missing the point. She said the cameras showed everything, showed the hours, showed the way Jasmine wrapped herself around her mother to keep her alive, showed her giving up the only protection she had, showed her slowly disappearing under the snow while refusing to let go. She asked them plainly what more proof they needed. The room went quiet. This was the first time someone with power had spoken up for Jasmine without hesitation, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of conviction, and the shift was immediate, subtle but real. Still, resistance lingered. Because systems don't change easily, and neither do biases. One of the officials mentioned Jasmine's status. The word hung in the air like a stain, homeless, unaccompanied, a minor. Concerns were raised about what would happen after discharge, about responsibility, about risk. Jasmine's heart sank. She knew where this could lead. Temporary solutions, temporary sympathy. Then back to the same streets that had nearly killed her, the same cold, the same invisibility, a quiet thank you and a return to nothing. She opened her mouth to speak and stopped. Because she was tired. Tired of proving she deserved safety. Tired of explaining why she existed. Tired of fighting systems that only noticed her when she disrupted their comfort. Catherine saw it. She saw the way Jasmine's shoulders slumped, the way hope flickered and threatened to go out. And in that moment, something hardened in her expression, not anger but resolve. She said something that changed everything. She said Jasmine wasn't leaving alone. She said this wasn't charity. This was responsibility. This was family. This was the least she could do after watching someone give their life without hesitation for a stranger. The officials pushed back, gently, legally, carefully. Catherine pushed harder. She talked about guardianship, about legal counsel, about accountability, about how if this situation were mishandled, people would hear about it, not as a threat, but as a promise. Jasmine listened in stunned silence. No one had ever fought for her like this before. Not publicly, not without conditions. For the first time since she was 14, someone was drawing a line and placing her firmly on the side of protection. The tension reached its peak there, not in shouting or violence, but in the quiet standoff between compassion and procedure, humanity and bureaucracy. Every person in the room knew the weight of the decision being made. And Jasmine understood something then that sent a chill through her, deeper than the cold ever had. Her survival had forced people to confront the way the world treated girls like her. There was no going back to comfort. No pretending this was just a feel-good story. Because now the question wasn't whether she had saved a life. It was whether the world would finally show her that her own life mattered too. The room felt like it was holding its breath. No one spoke for several seconds after Catherine's words settled into the air. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no sudden movement. Just a heavy, unmistakable pause, the kind that only happens when everyone present understands that something irreversible has just been said. Jasmine lay back against the pillows, her heart pounding harder than it had all night. She wasn't cold anymore. She wasn't freezing, but she felt exposed in a way she couldn't explain, as if her entire life had been placed on the table and examined under harsh light. One of the administrators finally broke the silence, choosing their words carefully, the way people do when they know they're being watched by history, even if no cameras are present. Policies were mentioned again, legal considerations, safeguards, the language of systems trying to regain control. But it wasn't working anymore, because the story had already escaped their grasp. Security footage had been reviewed in full now. Not just clips, not summaries, hours of it. Jasmine sitting perfectly still so the woman could lean against her. Jasmine pulling the blanket tighter when the snow intensified. Jasmine checking the woman's breathing again and again, even as her own movement slowed. Jasmine refusing to lie down, refusing to sleep, refusing to save herself at the cost of someone else. There was no angle that made her look suspicious. Only human. Only brave. Only terrifyingly young. One of the officers cleared their throat and admitted, quietly, that there was no indication of wrongdoing. No misconduct. No reason for continued questioning. The words should have brought relief, but instead they landed with a bitter edge. Because Jasmine knew how close she had come. How thin the line had been between being praised and being punished, between being saved and being erased. Catherine stepped closer to the bed then, her voice softer but no less steady. She thanked Jasmine, not the polite kind of thanks people give out of habit, but the kind that comes from realizing your life could have ended very differently. She spoke about her mother, about guilt, about the weight of knowing that everything she owned, every system she trusted, had failed in the moment that mattered most. And how the person who succeeded was the one society had prepared to fail. That truth rippled through the room. The officials left soon after, one by one, their authority drained of urgency. The door closed behind them, and for the first time since Jasmine woke up, the room felt quiet in a way that didn't threaten her. Still, fear lingered. Because survival had taught Jasmine that relief was often temporary. Catherine pulled a chair closer and sat down, not across the room, not standing over her, beside her, equal height, equal presence. She asked Jasmine what would happen next if nothing changed, where she would go, what she feared most. Jasmine hesitated. Then she answered honestly. She said she was afraid of going back to being invisible, afraid that this moment would pass and the world would move on without her, afraid that kindness would be celebrated in theory but punished in practice, afraid that she had used up all the luck she would ever get in one freezing night. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she said something that made Jasmine's breath catch. She said this wasn't going to be a story about a night. It was going to be a story about what comes after. She said her mother was alive because Jasmine chose humanity over fear, and that choice had created an obligation she was not willing to walk away from, not legally, not morally, not emotionally. She spoke about lawyers, about guardianship, about school, about stability, about a future Jasmine had stopped allowing herself to imagine because hopping had always hurt too much. Jasmine stared at her, stunned. This felt unreal, dangerous, like standing on ice that looked solid but could crack at any second. She had learned not to trust promises, especially big ones, especially from people with power. She whispered that people changed their minds. Catherine didn't deny it. She said that was true, but she also said that some moments change who you are permanently. That watching someone nearly die to save your parent was one of those moments, that this wasn't about rescue, It was about recognition. Recognition of Jasmine's worth, of her courage, of the fact that the world had failed her long before she ever found that woman in the snow. Jasmine felt tears rise then, uninvited and unstoppable, not loud, not dramatic, just silent tears slipping down her face as the weight of everything she had survived finally caught up to her. The streets, the cold, the fear, the constant need to be careful. And now this. Hope. Hope felt heavier than fear ever had. Because hope meant risk. The door opened quietly and a nurse stepped in to check her vitals. She smiled softly, unaware that she was interrupting a moment that would define the rest of Jasmine's life. After she left, Catherine stood and said she would return later. There were things to arrange, conversations to have, systems to confront. As she reached the door, she turned back. She told Jasmine to rest. She told her she was safe. The door closed. Jasmine lay there staring at the ceiling again, but this time, her thoughts were different. The question echoing in her mind wasn't whether she would survive. It was whether the world would finally let her live. Because outside that hospital room, decisions were still being made. Papers were still being drawn up. Reputations were quietly being reshaped. And when morning fully arrived, this story would no longer belong only to Jasmine. It would belong to everyone who had ever questioned who deserves protection and who does not. And what happened next would prove whether this was just another moment of attention or the beginning of something that would change everything. Jasmine didn't leave the hospital the way she entered it. When the doctors finally cleared her to sit up without assistance, when the machines were unplugged and the beeping faded into silence, she expected relief to rush in. Instead, what settled over her was something heavier. A quiet exhaustion that had nothing to do with hypothermia and everything to do with being seen, really seen, for the first time in years. Survival had never been simple for her. It had always come layered with conditions, with trade-offs, with fear. Even now, wrapped in clean clothes and warm blankets, she felt the instinct to stay small, to take up as little space as possible. Old habits don't disappear just because circumstances change. They linger. They whisper. The hospital room felt safer now, but it still didn't feel like hers. Over the next few days, people came and went. Nurses smiled and asked how she was feeling. Doctors explained recovery timelines. Social workers spoke in careful tones, outlining options and resources. Each conversation carried the same underlying message. Jasmine's life was still something to be managed, categorized, and placed somewhere acceptable. But something else was happening alongside all of that. Word spread. Not loudly, not in headlines or viral clips, but quietly through hallways, offices, and conversations that carried a different kind of weight. The security footage had circulated among staff. The story had reached people who didn't usually pause long enough to question their assumptions, and for some of them, it landed uncomfortably. They saw a teenager doing what institutions had failed to do. They saw compassion without cameras, courage without recognition. They saw a young black girl who had every reason to protect herself and chose not to. That kind of truth is difficult to ignore. Jasmine felt the shift in subtle ways, in the way questions stopped sounding like interrogations, in the way staff began addressing her directly instead of around her, in the way silence replaced skepticism when her name was mentioned. Still, she waited, because waiting had been her life. She waited for someone to change their mind. She waited for the kindness to expire. She waited for the moment she would be told, gently but firmly, that this was as far as it went. Catherine returned often. Not with grand gestures, but with presence. She sat beside Jasmine's bed and talked about ordinary things, school schedules, favorite foods, small plans that hinted at a future without demanding trust too quickly. She didn't rush. She didn't promise miracles. She listened. That mattered more than anything else. Jasmine learned that Margaret was recovering well, that the doctors were optimistic, that memory came and went but recognition remained. Knowing that the woman she saved was alive gave Jasmine a sense of peace she hadn't expected. It grounded her, reminded her why she had stayed. But peace didn't erase the questions. Jasmine began to understand that surviving the night had placed her at the center of something larger than herself. People wanted the story, but not all of them wanted the truth. Some wanted inspiration without discomfort. Others wanted redemption without responsibility. And Jasmine felt the tension of that expectation settle on her shoulders. She was praised for her kindness, but rarely was the system that left her vulnerable questioned with the same intensity. Her bravery was celebrated, but the circumstances that made such bravery necessary were spoken about more softly, if at all. That contradiction weighed on her, because Jasmine knew something most people didn't want to admit. Her story was remarkable not because she was exceptional, but because she was ordinary. There were countless girls like her, invisible, unprotected, forced to navigate a world that demanded resilience while denying safety. The only difference was that on one freezing night, the world had been forced to look at her. And looking changed things. Not everything, but enough. As discharge day approached, Jasmine stood by the window of her hospital room, watching snow melt along the edges of the sidewalk below. The city moved on just as it always did. Cars passed, people hurried. Life continued, indifferent and relentless. She wondered how many others were walking those streets right now, carrying their lives in backpacks, making choices no one should have to make. She wondered how many acts of quiet heroism went unseen because the people performing them didn't fit the image the world was comfortable applauding. Jasmine took a slow breath. She was leaving the hospital alive, but she was leaving changed. And the real impact of that night was only beginning to unfold. Leaving the hospital felt unreal. Jasmine expected a rush of emotion when the doors finally slid open. Relief, excitement, gratitude. Instead, what she felt was hesitation. Her body paused instinctively as if it were waiting for permission to move forward. For years, walking outside had meant bracing herself. For danger, for cold, for the possibility that nothing would catch her if she fell. Even now, with recovery behind her and options in front of her, the habit of caution refused to let go. Catherine stood beside her, not urging, not pulling, just present. That quiet patience made the moment bearable. Together, they stepped into the winter air. It was still cold, but not unforgiving. The kind of cold that reminds you of what you survived without threatening to take you under again. The drive through the city was silent at first. Jasmine watched familiar streets slide past the window, seeing them differently now. These were the same roads she had walked alone, the same neighborhoods that had once felt hostile and endless. Yet from this angle, sheltered and warm, she could see the contrast more clearly than ever. Safety wasn't about effort. It was about access, about who was allowed to rest without fear and who had to earn survival every night. That realization stayed with her. When they arrived at Catherine's home, Jasmine didn't immediately step out of the car. The house was large, quiet, surrounded by snow-dusted trees and fences that spoke of privacy and protection. It felt like another world, one she had passed through countless times without ever imagining she might belong there. No one rushed her. Inside, everything felt too clean, too soft, too permanent. Real beds, warm lighting, silence that didn't feel threatening. Jasmine kept expecting something to go wrong, for someone to tell her she was mistaken, that this wasn't real. But days passed, and then weeks, and nothing was taken back. Jasmine began attending school again, not without fear, not without doubt, but with support she had never known. Teachers asked what she needed instead of what she had done wrong. Counselors listened without trying to fix her too quickly. For the first time, she was allowed to be both strong and vulnerable. Still, the weight of her story followed her. People wanted to know, They wanted the moment, the sacrifice, the headline. Some framed it as inspiration, others as redemption. Few were willing to sit with the uncomfortable truth beneath it, that Jasmine's kindness had been born from a system that had already failed her long before that night. She noticed how often praise replaced accountability, how easily people applauded her resilience while ignoring the conditions that demanded it, how often conversations stopped just short of asking why a teenager had been homeless in the first place, why fear had shaped her choices more than trust ever could. Jasmine learned that visibility was complicated. Being seen brought opportunity, but it also brought pressure, the expectation to represent something larger than herself, to be grateful, to be quiet, to be exceptional. But Jasmine didn't want to be exceptional. She wanted to be safe. That desire forced her to confront something painful. Surviving racism doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion. Sometimes it looks like silence. And sometimes it looks like kindness that costs far more than it should. Catherine saw that weight and didn't try to erase it. She didn't push Jasmine to perform gratitude or to turn trauma into a lesson for others. Instead, she made space for healing without spectacle. That choice mattered more than any public recognition ever could. Slowly, Jasmine began to understand that her life no longer revolved around survival alone. She could make plans, think ahead, fail without falling through the cracks. That kind of stability was transformative, but it also sharpened her awareness of how rare it was. She thought often about the girls still out there, the ones who would never be given a second look unless tragedy forced attention, the ones whose kindness might never be recorded, whose fear would never be validated. And she knew that if her story meant anything, it had to point beyond itself. Because racism wasn't just about cruelty, it was about neglect, about whose suffering was normalized and whose was considered shocking, about how systems waited for heroism instead of preventing harm. Jasmine didn't have all the answers, but she carried the truth of that night with her, not as a badge but as a responsibility. A reminder that kindness should never require sacrifice to be believed. And that the real measure of justice isn't how loudly we celebrate bravery, but how urgently we dismantle the conditions that demand it. Jasmine never forgot the night in the snow. Not because it haunted her, but because it clarified something she had felt her entire life but never had the words for. That night stripped everything down to its truth. No titles, no wealth, no protection, just two human beings and a choice. And in that choice, the world revealed both its cruelty and its capacity for grace. Life didn't become perfect after that. Healing was not a straight line. There were nights when Jasmine still woke up tense, her body bracing for cold that was no longer there. There were moments when a raised voice or a uniform made her heart race. Trauma doesn't disappear when circumstances improve, it lingers, waiting to be acknowledged. But Jasmine was no longer invisible. She finished school, slowly, carefully. On days when self-doubt crept in, she remembered something vital. She had already survived the worst. Not just the cold, but the silence. Not just poverty, but being unseen in a world that often decided who mattered before listening to their story. Margaret's health stabilized. Some days she remembered everything. Other days she remembered only fragments. But one thing remained constant: she remembered Jasmine, not as a rescuer, not as a symbol, but as the girl who stayed. The girl who didn't leave her alone when leaving would have been easier. That mattered. What happened that night never made Jasmine rich. It didn't erase systemic injustice. It didn't magically fix racism, but it did something quieter and perhaps more powerful. It forced people to confront their assumptions. It exposed how easily kindness is overlooked when it comes from the margins, how quickly fear replaces empathy when race and poverty intersect, how often society praises sacrifice while ignoring the structures that make sacrifice necessary. Jasmine's story spread, not as a fairy tale but as a mirror. A mirror that asked uncomfortable questions. Why was a teenager homeless in the first place? Why did fear shape her decision to help? Why did survival require courage instead of support? And most importantly, how many stories like hers never reach the light? Racism doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it whispers through neglect, through systems that look the other way, through expectations that some people must endure more to be considered worthy of compassion. Jasmine never asked to become an example, but her existence became one anyway. Not because she was extraordinary, but because she was human in a world that often forgets who gets to be seen as such. Her story challenges us to look again, at the people we pass, at the assumptions we carry, at the moments when fear tells us to keep walking and compassion asks us to stop. Because change doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins with recognition, with the willingness to believe that dignity should not depend on circumstance, race, or visibility, with the courage to question systems instead of celebrating survival as if it were enough. Jasmine made it through that night, but not unchanged. And neither should we. Because if a 17-year-old girl with nothing could choose humanity in the coldest moment of her life, then what excuse do the rest of us have? How many more stories must be told before listening becomes action? And when the next choice presents itself, will we keep walking, or will we finally stay?